Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Stimson's Japan program hosted webinar, but truly this is another our Indo-Pacific initiative effort, connecting Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, reflection on the recent NATO summit. As you might have seen on this webinar announcement, this webinar takes a little bit of an unusual format. First 45 minutes, we're going to spend a panel discussion amongst me and my two good colleagues from Stimson Center about both of whom talks about Indo-Pacific views and your Atlantic views, and we'll see if two will ever converge or diverge, or they're going to stay parallel, or we'll see about that. So we're going to spend the first 45 minutes doing that. And last half an hour, we will welcome a special guest zooming in from Japan, Honorable Nobukatsu Kanehara, former Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary of Japanese Cabinet and Deputy Director General of the National Security Secretariat of Japan, who served directly for Prime Minister Abe when he was in the office. So that segment will come up about 10 o'clock, and first part of 45 minutes starting just about now as we are waiting for others to join us to the webinar room. We're going to get right away because our time is limited. But first, again, welcome to everyone. My name is Yuki Tatsumi, Director of Japan Program, Co-Director of East Asia Program here at Stimson. I am delighted to have two of my colleagues join me who can spend some time chatting about what happened in last week's NATO plus IP4 Summit, and what the outcome and how they assess it, and how do they see prospects and challenges moving forward. So let me first quickly introduce two of my great colleagues. I have a Dr. Kelly Greco, who is a senior fellow at Stimson's Grand Strategy Program. And I also have my good friend and colleague, Jenny Town, who is a senior fellow and director of our Korea program, and also a managing director of the 38 North, which make their name world famous, and they continue to make themselves famous. So welcome, ladies. Thank you for joining me this morning. So we all saw a lot of excitement last week on NATO Summit. We all battled through our traffic. We all chased our headlines. We survived all those road closures, random one to planned one, and traffic jam that ensued for all of us who were commuter to DC. But to say the least, this NATO plus IP4 summit was very different in tone from a last endeavor. First of all, this was a big deal to begin with because it is the 75th anniversary of NATO. But also, secondly, really, I don't remember any time that they got together with full IP4 participation, and at the end of which, they really came so strongly against China and very hard on China, specifically at labeling China as enabler of Russian war against Ukraine, and Ukraine being primary concern of this gathering. So how does each of you see where this is really coming from, and where you see this deepening relationship with IP4 and NATO countries growing? Maybe I'll start with you, Kelly, and then I'll follow up with Jenny.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Yuki, for hosting this event and the Japan program, and look forward to this discussion with Jenny as well. So I think, for me, there were two big takeaways from the NATO summit, and Yuki, you already got really one of them, which is there was a noticeable change in the tone, particularly of the final communique regarding China. I think one thing that was signaled in this summit was that China is now a focus of the alliance, and this definitely was the strongest language to date, calling it a decisive enabler of Russia's war, and also sort of an implicit threat being offered and saying that the PRC cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without there being a negative impact on its interests and reputation. So some kind of implicit threat, but not outlining any kinds of actual what steps might be taken. And the third area that I noticed that I thought was quite interesting about the statement regarding China was that it talked about sustained and malicious cyber and hybrid activities. and also accused it of using coercive tactics and efforts to divide the alliance. I can't remember a past statement where I've seen that kind of language, particularly around dividing the alliance. So that was sort of a noticeable shift. And so to me, it was almost dropping the diplomatic niceties and sending a warning shot with the statement. But I think it also gets at a larger problem about NATO's approach to China and also the IP4, which is that a lot of this seems to be about diplomatic posturing without a lot of substance behind it. So again, even this language of decisive enabler, Stoltenberg's been using for the last several weeks before the NATO summit, but we haven't heard anything about what kind of consequences there might be in terms of economic sanctions or things like that for China. And I think this again plays out when we look at NATO's cooperation with the IP4. I think I just note that it's noticeable that each time the IP4 have been part of the NATO summit has been high profile, which is understandable because it's unusual for partners to join in that way at a NATO summit. But this one in particular, I think, was even more high profile because it was one of the three core themes of the summit, the others being Ukraine and NATO's own deterrence and defense. And the third one was really the relationship with the IP4. So I think that's noteworthy. But when we look at sort of the substance behind it, the big deliverable were these flagship projects, it's calling it, for areas of cooperation. And the four outlined were supporting Ukraine, cyber defense, countering disinformation, and cooperation on emerging technology and artificial intelligence in particular, as mentioned. There's nothing really new here, is what I took away, though, is when you look at those projects, NATO's cooperation with partners is done through something called individually tailored partnership plans. And each of these four countries has those partnership plans. Japan, for example, recently updated its partnership plan. New Zealand's about to do the same. And those four areas are all areas that they're already working with the alliance in those specific areas. And so it's not exactly clear what else is being added here other than it's being sort of maybe repackaged a little bit as a deliverable. And I think, this highlights something, which is that, again, this seems to be about diplomatic signaling, but it's not clear that this is really in the interest of either party to be doing this in this way and in this high profile way. Because at the end of the day, what you see is that clearly, China does not respond well to this. This is not surprising. It came out with very strong language, saying that, that NATO has malicious intent was one of the quotes from their foreign ministry. It really feeds their paranoia, frankly, and it feeds the narrative that they want to sell in the region, particularly to South Asia and Southeast Asia, that this is about the United States trying to build security blocks and surround it. And even though NATO has taken steps to try to reassure China and to say it's not moving into the region, it won't be bringing a military presence, the truth of the matter is that NATO doesn't actually have a lot of credibility in this area in making those kinds of reassurances, because NATO's own history is sort of about a creeping NATO, where it says things like that, and it ends up in Eastern Europe bringing in new members, or it does out-of-area operations in Libya or Afghanistan. And the region remembers that. China remembers that, and the larger region remembers that. And it certainly doesn't help when former Supreme Allied Commanders of Europe, Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, floats an idea in an op-ed, for example, of expanding the alliance to officially have new members like Japan and South Korea join. None of that helps. But it would be one thing to maybe feed this paranoia on the part of Japan if it actually brought really significant gains in terms of deterrence capabilities to the region. And that's what we don't see here. When we look at the areas that they're cooperating in, like cyber defense, disinformation, it's raising the tensions with China, but only providing very marginal benefits in terms of actual deterrence and stability. And I think that's an enormous concern, particularly when there are other ways to connect Europe and Asia together, particularly on these issues that do not involve NATO. So the European Union actually has great competencies in all of these areas. It also allows for cooperation in other areas where I think Europe would even be more helpful, particularly in the economic areas, like supply chain resilience, economic sanctions, things like that. But it's much more palpable to the region, the European Union, because it's not a military alliance first. And so I think, honestly, there should be a really serious rethinking about whether NATO is the right connector for bridging Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And if anything, NATO sort of taking a back seat and lowering its public profile in terms of cooperation with the IP4. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Indeed, I think that's a lot of times, especially when you say, do you really want, this is there's the diplomatic posturing versus actual new substance, and especially those individual tailored partnership plan and the flagship plan. I was just thinking that when I was doing a quick research on what else new that Japan might have agreed or Japan might have launched, and I'm like, oh, everything is already kind of there. So you kind of hit the nail on the head on that one too. So Jenny, what do you think? And then, I'll come back to you, Kelly, on this too as a follow-up. But then now, especially what happened like over the last weekend, we're looking at potentially growing probability that we may have a different president, very different, foreign policy outlook in our capital sitting, dealing with these leaders come next January. I mean, I don't want to call it, election. You never know what happens, but Indo-Pacific IP4 countries, and for those of you who kept wondering what the heck we mean by IP4, that's Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And I am so sorry I kept, throwing around this acronym, assuming everybody knows this. But for those of you for clarity, that's the four countries that we're specifically talking about. Those are the U.S. allies in Indo-Pacific region that have more robust military cooperation on the spectrum of things with the United States. So anyway, Jenny, what do you think?
Well, thanks, Yuki, and thanks, Kelly, for really kind of framing the discussion this way. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak with my colleagues at Stimson. I think we do more online than we do in the office these days, but I have to agree with Kelly, especially on the concept of, this was a lot of diplomatic posturing. Of course, it was the 75th anniversary. There was a lot to really foot stomp the points and the strength of the alliance, the enduring nature of the alliance, and the expansion and the potential expansion and cooperation of the alliance amongst like-minded partners, especially those in the Indo-Pacific. But, I agree, there's a lot of questions about what that actually means in practice. And, for the Koreans, especially, coming at this from the Indo-Pacific perspective, there was a lot of strong language about China, of course, at this, as you've already discussed, but there was so much focus on Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And this has really been the driver for expanding IP cooperation over the past couple of years, and one that for right now really resonates with the Koreans. Because of especially because of Russia's growing relationship with North Korea, as well as for the defense acquisition side of the equation, a real opportunity for South Korea to be providing weapons into the system, but which also brings its own challenges and risks as well. I think in the Korea context, participation, this was the third time they've participated in the NATO conference, in the NATO Summit. And I think it came at a really ideal time for Yoon, especially when it comes to diplomatic posturing, to really try and demonstrate progress on his key policy of becoming a global pivotal state, as he likes to call it, the GPS. As well as to counter the recent upgrading of relations between Russia and North Korea into a comprehensive strategic partnership, which also reinstated the mutual defense arrangement between the two. And so, of course, while the NATO summit was planned long before those developments came about, the timing was really auspicious for Yoon. I think, this is really, while long-term support for Ukraine and its war was a major theme of the summit, the specific language condemning DPRK's military assistance to Russia in the NATO summit declaration, the expansion of cooperation between NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners, and the strong condemnation of illicit military cooperation between Russia and North Korea in the IP4 statement, were among several of the diplomatic wins that Yoon can point to show growing solidarity amongst, again, like-minded partners on issues affecting peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. But that said, as I think much of the rhetoric afterwards, and much of the assessments coming out of the summit are, the questions is always, how will this manifest into action? And deepening cooperation in areas like non-proliferation, cyber defense, science and technology, counterterrorism, interoperability, these have all been ongoing, as both of you have mentioned, for several years now, and they create mutual benefits, especially between NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners. But that cooperation, the deepening practical cooperation, the defense here, especially in East Asia, is still likely to be limited, despite the harsher rhetoric. Growing integration between the two regions brings its own risks, even on the Ukraine front. Like I said, in Korea, now there's renewed pressure on Seoul to provide lethal military assistance directly to Ukraine, and an action that's currently prohibited under South Korea's Foreign Trade Act. It's not just a policy. There's a reason why South Korea hasn't been doing this. This change in policy is unlikely to come about, because gaining the kind of bipartisan support that would be needed to amend the law is unlikely in the current domestic political environment in South Korea, especially given that the consequences are that Russia is likely to give more military technology to North Korea, as it is warned it would do. And so, presumably that bolstered support from Moscow would help accelerate Pyongyang's WMD programs in ways that further jeopardize South Korea's security situation. And while, President Yoon did his own posturing, saying that, Russia needs to choose which Korea it would rather have a relationship with, Moscow fired back, disagreed with this kind of binary thinking that it had to make a choice. If you look at the new treaty it just signed with Pyongyang, realistically, it seems it already made its choice, at least in the short term, because of the benefits that Moscow gets from North Korean military assistance. So, and of course, China's strong objections over the NATO's expansion into Indo-Pacific affairs, calling it destabilizing, bringing, the war to Asia as well, and its characterization, and really objecting to its characterization of China's relations with Russia. These could all also stall the recent momentum that we've seen in China-South Korea bilateral relations, China-Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation as well. And so, as you've both mentioned, this hardening of Cold War-like alignments and blocks is not in Beijing's interest, but neither is alienating its partners against growing NATO and Western creep in its backyard. So, while there's certainly plenty of people that are, concerned because of this harsh rhetoric that, we're actually pushing China into the exact kind of access that we don't want them to be engaged in and that we don't want to emerge. And so I think, there really needs to be greater sense of reassurance, and not so much dependence on simply deterrence messaging in all of these relations.
Yeah, thanks both for those perspectives. And I think I see a common threads here. So basically, there are two things I think it seems to me that kind of being highlighted from both of your comments. Is that one is, yes, deepening posturing sounds great, but what does that really mean? Especially when all these, high profile initiative that's been announced is really more of an update of what had already been there for the last few years as a trend line. And secondly, by going this way, aren't those two bodies actually alienating or running the risk of alienating the region, which actually becomes very, very critical when it comes to, resolving these kind of tensions and conflicts. It's a more of the global arena, right? Like, Kelly and Kelly, Jenny, you both mentioned, global South, Southeast Asia, and those are the typical example of the large regional larger regional players that really doesn't want to choose sides because of their complicated relationship with both, more like our side, quote unquote, and then quote unquote their side. So what are we doing here, right? To what end are we doing this, So I think there are already a couple of questions trickling in. And oh, by the way, the whole time that I was thinking, I kept thinking, we all worry about US presidency, but I just read the Japanese news that Prime Minister Kishida's, approval rating kind of like renewed its worst, and now he's down at like 15%. So if you look at, if you think about the political reality that, some of these leaders faces, right? Some of these leaders are having their domestic support level so low that even the, support rate that we're freaking out about President Biden being too low as an incumbent, 4 months away from election, some of these leaders would love to have that level of support, and they'll consider it as like a huge improvement. So what does that all mean? So we do have a couple of questions already coming in. So one of them really speaks to that, both of the points that you highlighted, which is does the growing NATO IP4 alliance and a unanimous and more unanimous looking anti-China rhetoric, what kind of implication do you think each of you think have for really their really, implication for global South, especially in like South Asia, like, BRICS and ASEAN? Maybe I'll start with you, Jenny, since I asked Kelly to start first.
Well, I just before answering the question, I really want to also highlight that Yoon also, this was auspicious for Yoon because Yoon's domestic political approval ratings are also quite low, like in the 20s. And so this is, a moment.
He's still better than Kishida, though.
He's still better than Kishida, except, the South Koreans have also started, there's weekly protests calling for his impeachment. And
oh, wow. Okay.
Given the fact that they have impeached a president in the recent past, they, and the National Assembly right now, the opposition party does have, the majority in the National Assembly. There's already been at least one hearing about the impeachment process that has been scheduled for later this month. And so he's in a very fragile place. And unfortunately, even though this highlights his accomplishments within the GPS sphere, I don't think it's going to resonate with audiences back in South Korea to really improve those approval ratings, especially given the risks that come with agitating relations with Russia, with China, and with North Korea, of which that tends to be part of the complaints against Yoon and his performance. I'm curious to hear what Kelly has to say on this question about, what are the implications for the global South? And I think, the reality is as much as we don't want a Cold War like alignment, I mean, this is exactly what we're pushing everyone into. And I think, we've created so much momentum for this, and all of the rhetoric, even just really emphasizing values-based diplomacy, values-based economics. I think even in South Korea, there's a level of uncomfort and discomfort of overemphasizing the values-based anything, because it does really limit economic opportunities. It limits political opportunities in a way that isn't good for domestic, considerations. And so while it might make a good show of solidarity around the world within these spheres of influence, it's doing the same on the other side. And it's creating, greater solidarity on the other side as well, as to, the need for a counterbalance to that. And so, what you've seen even within the BRICS in this year is a number of, for instance, countries that are de-dollarizing banks. You see a lot more cooperation within that sphere, which again creates opportunities, for instance, for countries like North Korea to really go around the system and find new partners. But this is a bit of, like, for me, a self-fulfilling prophecy, like all the things we don't want to come to happen by making strong deterrence rhetoric, strong solidarity rhetoric, strong values-based rhetoric. It is not having a deterrence effect. It is having an exacerbation effect. It's having a bringing together effect of the opposition. And so, like I said, unless we start really trying to better balance this sort of reassurance messaging as well, I think we're really just pushing each other towards a very dangerous, very conflict-prone situation where there's already hot wars, that there's sort of no end in sight right now as to how to resolve them, and they're expanding along the way.
Thank you. Yeah, I often, I've been thinking about that ever since, this, whole narratives of U.S.-China strategic competition starts to really accelerate, because I really don't see end in it either. I can't really envision where does this lead to ultimately. So thanks for talking to that point. Kelly, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. And then I'd like to just follow up a little bit on what Jenny said about reassurance, because I think that's so critical. But in regards to sort of the global South, NATO does not have a great reputation in the global South. In parts of Africa, for example, it has a horrible reputation because of the Libya operation, and it seemed as it was enormously destabilizing. And there are parts of Southeast Asia that see the same thing with Afghanistan. So there's that issue that is just seen as wherever it goes, it brings destabilization and conflict. Whether that is correct or not, that is the perception. And you look at Pew Research polls, you can see sort of they've asked publics around the world their perceptions of NATO, and you look in Southeast Asia, South Asia, overwhelmingly it's negative views of NATO. And I think, as Jenny was saying, the problem here is that it plays to a concern that these countries have, that they're being forced to choose, that the United States may be saying you don't have to choose, but its actions are suggesting that it wants them to choose. And I think that the reality is that the United States does want them to choose, regardless of what we say, in terms of what our actions are like. And I think there's a belief in Washington that over time, countries are still hedging, but over time, they're going to realize that China's a really serious threat, and they're going to come on Team USA. And I think that is actually a fundamental problem with the US approach. It's deeply flawed because it assumes that there are only two choices, the United States or China, but actually there is a third option, which is multi-alignment, which is what these countries are practicing, which is much more issue-specific alignments depending on the issue. Because today's world is more multipolar. It's not bipolar in the way the Cold War was. So it gives states more options, particularly middle powers like Indonesia, Singapore. They have more options than just one or the other. And the geography of the region matters a lot here too, because many of these countries are surrounded by water. So they don't have the same kind of acute security threat as in continental Europe. So I think that's an enormous difference. And I just wanted to read, if I can quickly, something Kurt Campbell said in the public forum about NATO and IP4 cooperation. He said, to those who say we can't take on an out-of-area mission, look, we all understand some of the hesitation. And the truth is there are a lot of countries that need to be talked to carefully and explained about what NATO is about. And I will just say that statement, talk to, I would just say, I think talked with, I think is a better approach. But I think it also reflects that understanding in Washington that these countries, if they just understood it better, they'll realize their own interests and will join us. And I think the reality is we need to realize they actually understand their own interests and they're making choices. And so that's why NATO is so problematic, because it is, at the end of the day, a military alliance. And so the question is, what else is it doing in the region and building cooperation, particularly interoperability, other than to try to, build up a security bloc? It's hard not to argue against that. And then the other thing I would just say is, I think Jenny brought up such an important point about, exacerbating tensions here. And I think we have, and about leading to negative strategic consequences, and one of those being pushing Russia and China more closely together, North Korea and Russia as well, but I think particularly Russia and China. And so, it's not an accident that China conducted military exercises with Belarus 5 kilometers from the Polish border on the eve of the NATO summit. I mean, this is not even subtle, right? But what's interesting is that the message that the way it was received by NATO is probably not, I think, how China intended it, which was to send a message of like, listen, if you can come into our backyard in our neighborhood, we can come into yours. I mean, I think this is not subtle again. But when Stoltenberg was asked about it, he basically said these exercises confirm that authoritarian powers are aligning together and that China's coming closer to us. There's no awareness on the part of NATO that in certain ways with IP4 cooperation, it is actually the party changing the status quo in the Indo-Pacific. And that some of its own the things that it's complaining about with China, like coming closer to it and closer cooperation with authoritarian powers, are the very things that China doesn't like that NATO and IP4 are doing. And so what's dangerous about this is that what we see is that we get stuck in action reaction, with both sides taking more actions to try to deter the other and both thinking they're at a disadvantage in deterrence. And this is just driving us towards, I think, what Jenny said, which is sort of more escalating tensions. And then you start to worry about how is this going to play out? Could we end up in some kind of accidental or inadvertent escalation? And what can we do to avoid this so that we can actually deter China? Because it's a serious problem without these downsides of sort of needlessly antagonizing it.
So, I mean, all excellent points. And I think this issue, basically, you know, all these like U.S. allies, not U.S. on it, you know, U.S., you know, singular, but it is actually U.S. allies that really bear the brunt of feeling the impact of those escalating tensions, right? So in Russia's case, you know, it's a continental Europe that feels it more. But then also in China's case, it's really Japan and Korea. And that's why I think Japan and Korea, Japanese and Korean leaders continue to look for some sort of, you know, dialogue or communication venue vis-a-vis Beijing, minus United States, such as, you know, China, Japan, Korea, you know, summit and other ministerial level meetings. And even though their agenda really primarily talks about economic cooperation, you know, trade, you know, grassroots exchanges, the aim is really that, right? They don't really want to 120% alienate China and cut them totally off, nor they can afford to.
Right.
So with this escalating tensions, I have another excellent question coming in. This is kind of more.
I can just say one quick thing to that because I think it's really important, which is
Yeah.
On that point, there is a way in which IP4 cooperation with the European Union in particular, I actually think in some ways it could provide a stronger deterrence without the negatives because the United States not involved. It actually shows an alignment of interest between Europe and IP4 countries, which China cannot see essentially the United States as being the orchestrator of this. And also given our volatility of our politics at the moment, provides a sort of insurance policy in certain ways around like what you're saying.
Yeah, you know, just to add to that, you know, I think especially for Japan and Korea, this has been watching the US elections is incredibly anxiety ridden as to.
Yeah, both of us usually get like expert on US election, right? At this every 4 years.
Well, and this year especially, it's so consequential because the potential for policies to shift in drastic ways is incredibly high. So the stakes are high because tensions are already high, because there's active wars going on, because you have, North Korea's capabilities continue to grow. They have growing cooperation with partners. I hear a lot in Korea of, one of the reactions to like the Putin-Kim summit and the upgrading of and signing of this treaty was the idea that, now North Korea has two treaty partners, two mutual defense partners, China and Russia, whereas South Korea only has one. It's like, well, the nature of that is very different. And I would put a lot more credibility into the US alliance relationship with South Korea than North Korea's relations with either China or Russia, especially in the long term, and especially, the willingness and ability to respond to conflict. But, there is growing questions about US credibility. And, while NATO still has a large US influence, I think you saw that at the summit as well, is again, greater hedging against the US future. How can we institutionalize? How can we really expand cooperation amongst ourselves to better, equip ourselves, our own alliance and our partners, and build our partners and networks in a way that can insulate us in case. And I think you do see a lot of that hedging in South Korea and Japan as well, of what are our options? How do we not get stuck with only one security partner? And if we do put all those eggs in one basket, what are the consequences of that if there is greater instability in the United States?
Thank you. And so follow on, this is a question from the audience, Jenny, so what does that mean for Korea, especially, but, question was both Japan and Korea, but, how their approach is China moving forward.
It's tricky.
I was going to say, I mean, for Japan, it's also extremely tricky, right? Because of the inherent geographical reality, which is, less acute than South Korea because there's a body of water between archipelago and the continent, but still, it's super close. Population wise, there are X times larger, military spending wise, same thing. And both Japan and South Korea are facing very similar situation here. So what do you think?
Yeah, no, I look back to, the idea that Yoon's approval ratings are very low. And one thing that Yoon did on the foreign policy front is he moved away from the historic kind of strategic ambiguity between the US and China, really trying to balance those relations in a more rational way, and really has gone with strategic clarity, right? Really aligning with the US, really aligning with Japan, really building the opportunity for trilateral security cooperation to take hold. But the question has always been, how sustainable is that? And I think, again, if you look at the US election cycle, and you look at the timing of when the CJK, the China, Japan, South Korea, trilateral high-level ministerial level meetings were really reinvigorated, I think there's a lot of concern about being too dependent and being too reliant on the United States. And I think there's, if Yoon should get impeached, or even in the next administration, I think there's likely to be a revert back to a more strategic ambiguity sort of arrangement, especially if the US, is in sort of political turmoil. And, I think there's a lot of questions now about where that goes. There's a lot of questions about, under a Trump administration, what his relations with South Korea especially will be, given how antagonistic he was towards South Korea the first time around. And, while there's been recent statements saying that, the alliance will continue, the US-ROC alliance will continue, there's also been, lots of statements from potential Trump administration officials about, South Korea should have nuclear weapons. South Korea should do more of their defenses. And so if there's a way to have the alliance and have nuclear weapons without that kind of stigma to it, that you would see under, say, for instance, a Biden administration, again, how destabilizing is that going to be in the region, especially with relations with China? So there's a lot of ways in which things could go very wrong very quickly, that makes it very unclear how any country is really going to respond in that moment. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty and anxiety right now.
Thank you. So this is, obviously, we're not as well versed as about the US allies down in the Pacific area, like Australia and New Zealand. But one of these questions is really kind of poignant. Part of this person's question is very poignant to the sense that in the questioning, one of the audience used the word, this was really specifically about New Zealand's foreign policy orientation. Did they depart from their independent foreign policy and join Australia as the word is like U.S. deputy sheriff, right? And that's how I don't think any of the U.S. allies want themselves to be seen. They want to make their own decision. So, but at the same time, though, this kind of optics of these deepening alliances across the region and across the two big, major theaters, more and more starts to have that perceptions, right? I mean, for a few years ago, I think one of our colleague institution kind of try to promote this idea of like a federated defense in the context of defense industrial corporation. And back then there was still like a lot of pushback to that from actual, allied countries, scholars about those notions. But what do you think about this? Are we kind of inherently, even though like Kelly, you said, like, rhetorically, you don't have to choose, but the action, especially with the de-risking / decoupling and, CHIPS Act and things like that, like, what is Washington actually inherently really pushing toward that and making, maybe pushing allies, both Indo-Pacific and Atlantic, kind of beyond, kind of to almost to the brink of their comfort level?
Yeah, so I think the New Zealand question is interesting, right? Because they have a new not administration, I don't think that's the word they use there, but new government that has been a bit more assertive on China issues than is, the past. But I think it's important to put these things in perspective, which kind of gets to Jenny's point as well, which is that countries have sort of a range of how far they're willing to go in either direction. And their domestic politics can influence what that range is. I think in New Zealand's case, when I've talked to officials from there and also scholars, one of the things they emphasize is that China's activity around the Pacific Islands has been a wake up for New Zealand. There are concerns about that because that's their neighborhood. And actually, a lot of it's also around Chinese fishermen that are also coming all the way down there as well. I think their concerns are much more local, though, in terms of security issues around the Pacific and a recognition that they need to probably do more to improve their Navy. They have a very, very small Navy and it's old. So there's some recognition of that. But for New Zealand, their most important security relationship, their only ally, treaty ally, is Australia. The United States withdrew from the Anzac Treaty and our alliance obligations to New Zealand in the 80s. So I think in their case, it's much more local, and we're seeing a little bit of shift in tones, but not as much in terms of actual policy. But I do think that, one of the consistent themes I've heard when I've talked to people in the region and done interviews with people in the region, former senior government officials, security experts, is they emphasize is that they very much feel the United States is pushing them to choose. And I think the more that we continue with that approach, the less successful we're going to be. Because the reality is, in some ways, China is the best salesperson for actually closer alignment with the United States. The more China is out in the world and it engages in bullying behavior and coercive activities, the more it raises security concerns of these countries. And either that's in increasing defense budgets or looking for more partners. But it's not going to just be the United States. I think, as you both have emphasized, it's going to maybe want a security bilateral relationship with Japan or South Korea or India or European partners. And so I think we have to recognize that the dichotomy is not what countries are interested in. They want options. And so we have to learn how to navigate, I think, a region where it is built around minilaterals, lots of shifting coalitions, and learning how to navigate that in a way to be much more successful rather than trying to impose the old Cold War model of choosing teams, because that's just not how we're going to be successful.
Jenny, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree completely with Kelly on this one of, just the concept of we really need to get better at politics in modern day. because it's like, the countries do have choices, and they're not always going to take the choices we want them to make, and especially if we make that choice as basically unattractive, right? And again, I think the more, even so, for instance, even in the South Korea relationship, the idea of, a lot of the push that's being done to implement the Washington Declaration and really try and integrate greater conventional nuclear integration and the nuclear consultative group, there is a sense that, we need to get as much done as possible before the election because we don't know what's coming next. And that's not a great assurance message to our allies, where yes, we are willing to adapt, but there's always this room for change afterwards. And if this is the reality of the situation now, and countries are going to do what they need to do and what serves their best interest in that process. And if we force them of binary choices, we run the risk of them making binary choices.
So I just saw our special guest from Japan, Kanehara-san, joined us. So I hope he can turn his camera on soon. There he is. So thank you, Kanehara-san, for joining us. So with
Thank
that,
you very much for having me. Yes.
With that, Kelly, Jenny, this is a great segue into the latter half of the special programming. So thank you both again for all your perspectives, and please feel free to stay, turn off the camera, and listen in as if you do have availability for that. But from here, thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Jenny. We are now moving into our special segment section of this webinar. So as we announced earlier, we have a Mr. Nobukatsu Kanehara, former Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary and the former Director General, Deputy Director General of the National Security Secretariat of Japan. And he was one of the major foreign policy architect of late former Prime Minister Abe when he was in the office. And he worked directly for in the National Security Secretariat during Prime Minister Abe's time in the office for a good close to 8 years, if I recall, before he retired from the government service. Currently, he's actively teaching, and then also he continues on his research on national security issues at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, where he now is a part of the board. And he recently in Japan published co-authored book with his former Deputy Director General NSS colleague, Ambassador Nobushige Takamizawa, on the paper book size of more like a textbook for a Japanese national security policy for layman type of easy to approach kind of handbook. So I'm hoping that book to be bestseller and one of the books this year in Japan. So Kanehara-san, thank you so much again for joining us. I know it is late in the evening.
Yes.
So appreciate your time. So for the first 45 minutes, we talked about really focused on what came out of NATO Summit last week in general, directly. But this deepening cooperation with NATO is you really start seeing it blossoming when you were in the government under late Prime Minister Abe's leadership. And if you will, incumbent Prime Minister Kishida kind of added his own touch to it. So seeing that evolution, very, very closely, how do you assess from your vantage point what this deliverables of a NATO summit last week kind of signifies for Japan and Japan's past several years of approaches with NATO and where it's going forward?
Good. Thank you very much for having me. For us, the biggest challenge this century is China. And when the Cold War is there, we're looking at the backs of the Russians, and the jewel was grabbed by NATO. Where we felt safe because NATO is there. On the other side, China is a dragon, but the tail is very short. Europeans can see it. It's only Japan, US alliance, and other allies who have to take care of it. And Taiwan issue is a volatile issue now. If there's no Taiwan, we don't panic, but we have Taiwan issue in front of us. And this is the first time that we discuss about the defense of Taiwan. China was so weak. It has never been on agenda. During these 10 years, we have to think about this now. And we are thinking about Hokkaido and North Korea. Taiwan, Philippines, for the first time came to the surface of our discussion now. And so we feel that the Japan-US alliance plus Koreans and the Australians, Filipinos ties, these are the only allies. There's no bureau, there's no secretariats, there's no one single plan, there's no one single commander. This is just 5 bilateral linear alliances here. Threat perceptions are very different. And China is not very big now. Can we cope with it? Now, our thinking is we have to gather the facts showing that we are the mainstream, we are sustaining liberal order and the rule of law, and we have to defend that, the whole system, and we cannot let China invade Taiwan. This is against the agreements of 1972. We respect one China, that's fine, but don't attack Taiwan. That was a precondition for that. And we can never accept the arguments that the island was ours. Chiang Kai-shek went there, he was defeated, so island is mine, people is mine. We can never accept this. If we accept that, we have to accept Putin's project. Ukraine is mine. That's 19th century. But we cannot do this alone. And this is systemic challenge, as NATO said once. If China can shake the liberal order in this way and nobody register against it, our liberal order will collapse, and we are drawn back to 19th century. For that purpose, we have to coordinate, and China, Russia are coming closer, maybe grudgingly, but they are coming closer and closer. So the Americans, Europeans, and Japanese, Koreans, Australians, we have to look into this Asian continent. There are 3 big ones there: Russia, China, and India. We have to take one among 3 on our side at least. The Americans used Stalin to finish Hitler, right? But Nixon hugged Mao to face the Russians. Now we need Indians. They are coming slowly towards us. They can't cut off Russia, but they are coming towards us. So we have to realign this liberal order with the newly emerging leaders. This is what we have to do. But before that, we have to cooperate with Americans, but we need Europeans. NATO is an organization, the military one, right? And their area of responsibility is very clear. It's Atlantic. But outer space, cyberspace, maritime, the oceans, there's no limit there for the exchange of the reconnaissance and the satellites and the cyber protection, these things. There are abundant. There are many fields where Japan and the NATO can cooperate, and we have to do that. We have to sustain the whole system, and if we are not prepared, our system can collapse. Now, can I add one more thing? The West dominated, West meaning including Japan, West plus Japan, dominated the international scene for the last 200 years. For the first time, we are now shrinking in proportion, even Americans. Americans had more than 50% world economy, now they are less than 25%. G7, 80%, 90%, we're now less than 50%. China grows and India grows, Indonesia grows. And truly, we have to think seriously to sustain our liberal order together. Otherwise, we'll be marginalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanehara-san. So obviously, there are already a couple of questions that are coming in after you started speaking. So I'll take it as that these are the questions for you. So the first question that I want to pose is, what impact will, as you saw, one of the NATO summits last week's highlight was they're really promoting this idea that the NATO's cooperation with IP4 countries, that certainly includes Japan and South Korea, will continue to grow. So what this kind of a NATO trajectory have for actually bilateral relations between Japan and South Korea, which can be volatile at times, as we all remember?
Well, Koreans are now, I think Koreans are changing a bit. They are focused on North Korea, and they couldn't even see Japanese support from backside, and Americans are up front. Now, that is their strategic view. Now they grew and they are very big now. The G8 size, G7 size economy, and they are fully confident. The young Koreans are very different. The Koreans in their 30s, 20s are very different. They say global Korea, like big Japan, or 20 years ago. And I think the Koreans are becoming more and more responsible for regional security, not only local peninsular security. And it is very good for them to come to NATO Summit together with us. And in particular, their domestic politics is heavily ideologically divided, just like Japan in 1970s. And the Minjudan and the Kuminehim, the conservatives are fighting against each other. And luckily, we have now the conservative government, and he's very strategic. He's very strategic. Maybe Lee Myung-bak and Yoon Suk-yeol, these leaders are great leaders, and they are putting Korea into right strategic direction. And we could deepen our understanding and cooperation with them. And NATO to promote our strategic relationship.
Thank you. And obviously, for those of us who watch, who focuses on relationship with U.S. allies here, based here, we all become instant U.S. presidential election experts every 4 years. But I'm sure, Japan is one of the country that follows the U.S. presidential election development very, very closely. What do you think about another potential of another Trump presidency, and what kind of an impact it could have in the U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific region? Would the potential next Trump administration, what type of challenge does that entail for the allies in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan, and of course including South Korea as well, in your view?
We're comfortable with Biden's approach to gather the allies. That's traditional American approach, right? To gather allies, Europeans and Japanese, Koreans, and Australians, and sustain this federal system as a whole. Then we can somehow engage or contain the Putin's aggression or Chinese unilateral behavior to change the status quo. And that's if President Trump comes back. I think he thinks that the alliances are less important than Biden thought, and he can be somehow unilateral actions will increase, but that's not to mean that Americans will go back to isolationism. That does not mean that Americans are going back to say the sort of the Monroe Doctrine time. And Trump says, "Make America great again." He never said, "Make America miserably weak again." He hates to be defeated, and he hates to be seen weak. And his aides are, in the first administration of Trump, his aides are not so bad. Mr. Pence, Mr. Mattis, Mr. McMaster, Bolton, and Mr. Pompeo, and Pottinger, and they are China hawks. And they changed the Obama-China policy from sort of pure engagement to great power competition, and that is borrowed by Biden. So if his aides are okay, I think he can be okay. But we have to see who will be with them. Vance will join the ticket of Trump, right? And he's sort of the new vein of Republicans. He listened to the unheard voices of the laborers, conservative laborers of Rust Belt, and that's votes that Trump found, and that's Trump's core supporters. And if Vance is okay, Trump could be okay. Mr. Pence supported Trump well. If his aides are very important, if his aides are okay, he'll be okay.
So obviously, we really don't know Vice Presidential nominee Senator Vance's outlook on foreign policy, because, as you mentioned, his road to fame is his book about his memoir, right? As a kid growing up in a Rust Belt, the Hillbilly Elegy. So of course, we really don't know much about what kind of what type of thing he thinks about in his foreign policy. But so when the first time Trump was a president, Prime Minister Abe, for example, after he pulled, when the President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the TPP, Prime Minister Abe really pulled the rest of the TPP countries together and really brought it to the finish line and create the CPTPP, which is basically essentially TPP minus the United States. Do you see Japan, should something like that happen again? Do you see Japan playing a similar role in terms of try to make sure that all these U.S. allies and partners in the region, whether that's Indo-Pacific or across the region, including NATO, will stay, I guess, connected and, maintain the cooperative relationship that they had managed to build to this point?
Abe-san just filled in the vacuum that Trump created. So he went to ASEAN nations, the 50 times or 60 times. And he went to ASEAN nations and any meetings, any conferences. And it is very important to meet the heads of states in this way. And the free trade too. Free trade is very important. The global south is now rising, right? And their first concern is not values, democracy and rule of law. Their first concern is development still. It's money, investment. And free trade guarantees that our technology and money go down to second tier, from second tier to third tier, from Japan to, say, China or Southeast Asia. Now it's going down to West Asia, right? Simply because the money goes to the places where they can be produced. That's investment. But the advanced nations must face the harrowing industry and aging population, and they have to cope with that. If you close your markets, what will happen is, if tariffs are high, consumers must pay the price. And this industry can be weaker, and the aging can go faster industrially, right? So we have to go ahead. Americans are doing well with the internet and the digital industry. We are lacking. We are going behind, but we have to make efforts. Ironically, it is Japan who is saying that the free trade is important. If we don't say free trade is important, we cannot engage emerging new powers like India, like Indonesia, and other nations. If we shut our door, the newly emerging nations say, bye-bye West. They say, bye-bye West. So we have to engage them. For that purpose, the free trade is very important. Japan is now aiding society, and industry is much weaker than American ones, but we're still waging the flag of free trade. I think my government must continue that. It's from Abe-san. Nobody did that before. We are just following the free traders. Now we are suddenly up front. And we are now waging the flag of free trade. We have to do that. Europeans are doing the same thing. We have to do it. If Trump comes in and passes the vice president, I'm sure that protectionists will be strengthened. But we have to face that somehow. But in the end, American consumers will pay, and they have to understand it.
That's a very important point. So you mentioned about during the 4 years of Trump administration, then Prime Minister Abe really just filled the void, that leadership void that's been created
in Asia
because of that in Asia. So you could potentially see a situation, depending on how this November rolls, you could see another U.S. leadership void, but this time it will be across the globe, right? In the situation where there's a conflict in the Middle East, there's a conflict active conflict in Europe, and there's an inherent worsening tension in the Indo-Pacific. Right. So who do you see, if not a one singular leader, maybe it might have to be a collective, collection of small group of leaders, but who do you see as most, I guess, fit is not a very good word, but who would be you think, willing to step in and try to fill that void, should that void be created?
It's a very difficult question to answer. If the Washington is with Trump, and we are having the party elections of LDP in October, in October, and the Kishida-san can very well continue, but we can have the change of the leaders. The British changes the prime minister, Labour is coming in, and the French the same. Maybe leftists will be stronger to influence the Macron. Netherlands are very much to the right. we don't see a great strong leader. Tusk is back in Poland. It's good. But as a whole, West is now suffering from the lack of leadership. Abe-san is in heaven, of course. So they will have to have somehow collective leadership. And the Blinken is working hard for that. I don't know whether Trump team will do this or not.
And one of the things that you mentioned is the global South and the growing importance of global South and emerging leaders. And you talked about India, you talked about Indonesia, but how their prime concern is really about their own economic development.
Right.
Japan historically has a track record of building relationship with the region like that. I think about Southeast Asia, think about Fukuda Doctrine. Do you think that lesson can be similar lesson? Of course, dynamics is very different, but do you think that a similar lesson can be applied in the case of the current situation here in terms of engagement with the global South and emerging countries?
Right. So we have to say that this liberal international order that we have created in the last century, it took maybe 5 or 6 decades, right? We profited to war, 1945, and then we finished the colonialism and the racial discrimination in 1950s, 50s, and 60s. And now we have this one. And communist dictatorship just fell in 1990s. And this, our world, has been created in a recent time. And we have to sustain that. We have the free trade system. We have the liberal system, the political system. And we have to sell our system and values to the newcomers. And you can be much bigger and greater in our system. And finally, you can share our leadership with us because we are shrinking, you're young, you're free, your influence is very big. And we have to persuade them. Unfortunately, the Putin abandoned G8 and invaded Ukraine. And China is now leaving us, unfortunately. I don't think it's rather Xi Jinping rather than China, but she is now leaving us and turning his back against us and aiming at Taiwan. And we have to face that. And they are telling their friends in the global South that dictatorship is okay. Don't fear the Americans. We can have our own way. It's wrong. Even China has become very big inside our system. Without WTO, without free trade, China has never been prosperous like this. China should stay with us, but they are a bit confused. They can't think clearly, and they are a bit confused because of maybe Taiwan. But we cannot derail the other big ones like India, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, or Saudi Arabia, or South Africa. We have to engage them in our system, and they can join us. We should not be too much short-tempered, like the Americans, Europeans punish these nations, sometimes human rights because are very bad. They don't punish the worst ones like North Korea. They punish the good ones. But we have to be a bit patient because we came here after 200 years of atrocities of wars and dictatorship and the colonialism and racial discrimination. We came here after only 200 years. And now young nations are coming up. So we have to encourage them to join us and to share our responsibility to sustain this system. That should be our message to them.
So sounds like in this time, in that kind of time, the leadership is very, very important from the developed
right.
countryside. But
Right.
unfortunately, as you laid out, domestic politics and across the globe on our end is all over the place, including Japan. So how do you see Japan itself? As you mentioned, it's a ruling Liberal Democratic Party is having an election for its party leader. And depending on it, we may see Prime Minister Kishida continue, or we may see other LDP leader leading Japan. Who do you see as the potentially emerging to continue to carry the torch of foreign policy kind of a legacy that's embedded when Prime Minister Abe was still in the office? For Fourth Vision, whether that may be a Fourth Vision, defender of the commons, defender of the liberal international order, such and such.
The LDP will continue to stay in power, and our objections, the constitutional Democrats or national Democrats or Ishin, and they cannot be united. So LDP will stay in power. That means the Abe's basic strategic line will be kept somehow. And some would push this harder, some would push this softly, but anyway, the strategic, we stay in the course, we stay in the course, that's for sure. And but it depends upon who would be in our White House, the Prime Minister's office. Usually the Ishiba-san, Kono-san, and Koizumi-san, they are regular candidates in the presidential elections of LDP. But now we are talking about the females. And Kamikawa-san, he is foreign minister. And if she is in Kishida faction, so if Kishida-san steps down, she can be pushed out as a candidate. And on the other side, the conservative branch of LDP, Takaichi-san is now on the list of possible candidates. There can be two females fighting against each other. Just in Tokyo metropolitan.
I was going to ask.
Renpo-san are fighting. So in the national elections, these two women can be fighting against each other. I'm telling to these foreigners that our highest god in Japan's mythology is Amaterasu. And she is the guardian of our imperial family, and she is a woman. So this nation is woman's nation. So if the woman is a leader, Japan can be revived.
That is a great punchline, by the way. So you talked about Japan now waving the free trader flag and how that's actually very, very important, even if things are difficult. So how does Japan view, you mentioned also in the course of that WTO, what can it do? I mean, you could want, some people argue like, the way that WTO currently resolve the disagreement are somehow, this can be dysfunctional, to say the least. So what can Japan, perhaps in a cooperation with the other free trader, like, free trade advocates like South Korea and others, try to save the WTO is a really wrong word, but that make WTO really more, viable again in the global trading system?
The WTO is now dysfunctional. The appellate body, and we cannot replace the members there, right? So it's dysfunctional. There's only first tier. There's no appealing body here. Now we have to do something to this. Americans are against, and there's some philosophical clash between Americans and Europeans. Americans think this is just framework, sort of, to facilitate trade. If there are disputes, the body must facilitate the discussions and solve this problem. A solution-oriented, just framework, that's American thinking. Europeans think this is just like a judge court. And it's more and more bureaucratic, and Americans hate that. This is a big clash. And I have to say China's sort of collective negotiation style in many organizations, that irritates Americans very much. It's one state, one votes, one sovereign state, one votes. You can have a group, but in the end, each nation have its own opinion, and each nation must have a deal with everybody. That's American thinking. But these days, China makes a big group of the developing nations and the bloc politics, and that angers Americans too. So WTO is now in a very difficult place. I think I don't remember her name, but the new leader WTO from Nigeria, she's very capable, and we have to help them anyway. The WTO must be saved, that's for sure. But it's in a very difficult situation. That's the reason why we are now pushing for some EPA, bilateral, or with EU, or it's much easier to do that. So we are now doing that. And so we have to somehow do something to save the WTO, but we can't wait. So we have to push forward some other bilateral or regional free trade agreements like RCEP, WTO, CPTPP. That's something that we have to do at the same time. Free trade is important not only for the advanced nations. Free trade is more important for the developing nations. They can absorb the direct investments, technology, and money, and they prosper. And that's the beauty of free trade. And we have to save this somehow. The biggest problem is Americans are now turning their back against free trade. They say they have to protect their own people and their own industry, but if it goes against the market, anybody who goes against the market will be the loser in the end. The Americans are doing very well in digital economy. We're lagging behind very quickly. Do something there. The Americans can still be the leader. And the American stock price is hitting ceiling every day, right? That's because of the digital industry, internet industry, and Americans can still lead the free trade.
Thank you, Kanehara-san, for that thought. This half an hour really flew by. I have to let you go to sleep. It's already 11:30 at night over in Tokyo. Thank you again for joining me. Yes.
Don't you pick up the questions from the floor?
I already did. So all these questions that I picked, I already picked them up.
Okay,
so yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good to see you again, right?
Yeah, good to see you again, as always. So
yes,
thank you again for joining us, and have a great end of the evening. Oyasumi nasai.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.